Hello, this is part 2 of my DVD collection video, where I talk about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1990s, but if you haven't already, go check out part 1 of this video. Now, I'm going to admit right off the bat that not all the movies I'm going to put on this list are necessarily masterpieces. Some of them are genuinely good movies, but there are a lot of movies on this list that I'll admit are more guilty pleasures, and nostalgia plays a major factor in me putting some of these films on this list. Case in point, the first movie I want to talk about for this part of the video is Leprechaun. And I'll fully admit that Leprechaun is not a terribly good movie by any means, but it's a film I've always personally enjoyed as a guilty pleasure. Like, for me, this is almost a so bad that it's good kind of film, and one of the problems that Leprechaun has, at least the first film, is it really doesn't know what it wants to be, because there are parts of this movie where it almost feels like this should have been a kid's horror film. But oddly enough, that's actually a reason why I do kind of like this film, because as bad as this movie is, it does have a weird charm to it that really does appeal to me, and I personally love the film, but once again, I love the film as a guilty pleasure. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts of this movie, I did do a review of this film as well as all the sequels to this a few years ago, and just recently me and my friends did an entire retrospective on the Leprechaun franchise. The next movie I want to talk about is the sequel to Leprechaun, Leprechaun 2, which is my personal favorite film in the Leprechaun franchise, and I actually will argue that this is a better film than the original, and is actually a good film in its own right, because one of the things that this movie has above the original is I feel like this one actually knows what it wants to be, and it also is definitely geared more towards adults, and like they definitely up the violence in this one, and it's also funnier too. Like there's some really funny moments in this movie. The next movie I want to talk about is the third Leprechaun movie, Leprechaun 3, which is actually a fan favorite among a lot of Leprechaun fans, and Warwick Davis, who plays the Leprechaun, has actually said that this is his favorite film in the franchise, and honestly, though I like Leprechaun 2 better, I can honestly see why this is a fan favorite, because there is, believe it or not, some subtle satire in this movie, and some of the jokes in this movie are really freaking funny. And the next movie I want to talk about is the fourth Leprechaun movie, Leprechaun 4 in Space, which, objectively speaking, is the worst film in the franchise, yet I love it because of how bad it is. Like, for me, this is a pure guilty pleasure, even more so than the first Leprechaun movie. But yeah, the first 4 Leprechaun movies, I'll fully admit, are not great movies, but they're films I've always personally enjoyed. And once again, me and my friends just recently did a retrospective on the Leprechaun franchise, so if you want to know more of my thoughts on these movies, just check out that retrospective. Now, I'm not sure if maybe I just lost all my credibility by including the Leprechaun movies on this list, but now on to a genuinely good and genuinely terrifying horror film, and a really underrated horror film at that, and that is Fire in the Sky, which is arguably more of a drama film than a straightforward horror film, but it has some definite horror elements. Now, the movie is supposedly based on a true story. That depends on how much credibility you give the people who were involved with this case, and that also depends on whether or not you actually believe in alien abductions. Now, the movie is about this group of loggers who actually witness their friend get abducted by aliens, and nobody will believe them when they say what happened, and there are a lot of people who think that they had something to do with their friend's disappearance. And really the film is mostly a drama about these characters dealing with this, but towards the end of the film, when you find out what happened to him on the alien spaceship, it becomes a legitimate horror film, and the scene that takes place on the alien spaceship is one of the most terrifying scenes in any movie. So even though it's mostly a drama film, The last 10 minutes are pure, unadulterated horror. The next movie I want to talk about is a flawed movie, but it's a film I've always personally enjoyed, and that is The Dark Half, which is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, and was actually directed by George A. Romero. And I think this was the last time that George Romero and Stephen King really worked together, even though Stephen King didn't directly work on this movie, but it is based on one of his stories. But The Dark Half is a really interesting movie. Basically, it's about this author who, for years, has been writing under a pseudonym, but one day he decides to give up writing under this pseudonym, and basically this pseudonym comes to life and starts killing people. But yeah, The Dark Half is a good movie. I do think it's a flawed movie. It's a movie that I do think I kind of like more for the premise alone, but it's still a good film, and the book that this is based on I do think is one of Stephen King's most underrated books. The next movie I want to talk about is Ticks, which as you can see I don't have on DVD. I have this on VHS, but Ticks is a really fun movie. Admittedly, it's more of a guilty pleasure, but it's still a really fun film, and it has some really cool creature effects. Basically, it's about these marijuana farmers who spray this chemical all over the marijuana they're growing to make the marijuana grow bigger, and it ends up making these ticks mutate into these giant ticks, and in the movie these troubled kids who are taken out into the wilderness encounter these giant ticks. Once again, it's a fun movie, and the film also has Seth Green in it, and the guy who played Carlton from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. He plays a thug in this movie, so if you could take Carlton seriously as a thug, this movie has it. The next movie I want to talk about is Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, which I know is considered by a lot of people to be one of the worst Friday the 13th movies, but truth be told, I love this one. I really, really do. It is more of a guilty pleasure, but honestly though, I really don't see what's so bad about this movie. It does do something really different, and honestly, I appreciate it because of how different it is. And I think the movie's fun, I like the characters, and I actually think it's a really well-made movie. I don't really understand why people hate this movie so much, other than the fact that it does do something radically different from the other Friday the 13th movies. But once again, who cares? I also think it's a pretty good precursor to Freddy vs. Jason, because Freddy vs. Jason arguably picked up where this movie left off. The next movie I want to talk about is Return of the Living Dead 3, which, truth be told, I think is the best of the Return of the Living Dead sequels. I don't think it's as good as the first Return of the Living Dead movie, but as far as the sequels go, I think this one is the best of the sequels. Now, the movie is directed by Brian Yuzna, who I think is a very underrated horror director. And one of the things I really appreciate about this one is it doesn't try to be a horror comedy like the first two Return of the Living Dead movies were. It's actually a pretty serious movie, and it's actually sort of a body horror film. And it's actually a really sad movie, too, especially when you see what Mindy Clark's character is going through in the film. I really enjoy Return of the Living Dead 3, and once again, I think it's the best of the Return of the Living Dead sequels. And I have Return of the Living Dead 3 on this DVD set right here. The next movie I want to talk about is Guillermo del Toro's first movie, Kronos, which I think is one of the most unique vampire films ever made, and not just is it a great horror film, but it's also a really touching movie about the relationship between the main character and his granddaughter. I really do enjoy Kronos. Somewhere down the line I might do a standalone review of this movie, because there is a lot that I want to say about this film. The next movie I want to talk about is Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead, which out of all the Phantasm movies, this is by far the most insane film in the franchise. It's not my favorite film in the franchise, that honor would go to the first one, and it's not as good of a sequel as Phantasm 2, but it's still a really fun movie, and it's definitely the most insane film in the franchise. The next movie I want to talk about was actually a made-for-TV miniseries, and that is Mick Garris's 1994 adaptation of Stephen King's The Stand. Now, I'll admit that this movie is somewhat of an anomaly for me because I do enjoy the film a lot. I mean, obviously I enjoy it, otherwise I wouldn't be putting it in a video of my favorite horror films of the 1990s. At the same time, though, I do think it's a deeply flawed film. This is one of those movies I was talking about earlier where nostalgia does play a major factor in terms of my feelings towards it. Because once again, I think the movie has a lot of problems, but arguably I would say this is probably Mick Garris's best work, because Mick Garris is a very, very hit-or-miss director for me, and in some ways I would say the miniseries is very well made, but in other ways it has a lot of the same problems that so much of Mick Garris's other work has. So as you can see, my opinions on this movie are somewhat mixed, but for nostalgic reasons, because I first saw this movie when I was 13 years old, and I absolutely fell in love with it at the age of 13. As an adult watching it, I recognize that it is deeply flawed, but it's still a decent movie, and I do recommend it. Now, I don't think it does justice to the book at all, but in some ways it actually kinda does. Like, I think Jamie Sheridan steals this movie as Randall Flagg. Now, I have The Stand on this DVD set right here where it also comes with 2 other Stephen King movies. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that you could argue is not really a horror film. I personally would consider this to be horror, but I will admit that it's more of an action film than a straightforward horror film, but it does have some definite horror elements, and that is The Crow. And regardless of what genre you consider The Crow to be in, The Crow is a brilliant movie. Now, the film is based on James O'Barr's graphic novel of the same name, which was later spawned into an ongoing comic book series. But The Crow is a great movie, and the movie did a lot for comic book movies at the time. Admittedly, it's more of an action film than a straightforward horror film, but it has some definite horror elements, in my opinion. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the times I think genre can be a matter of opinion. So, yes, it's more of an action film, but I do think it has some horror elements. The next movie I want to talk about is Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I think is actually Wes Craven's most underrated film, and this is the 7th film in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but truth be told, I actually think of this film as being separate from the rest of the movies because it's not in continuity with any of the other Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Rather, the film's actually about the people who made the Freddy Krueger movies. Essentially, the film's about this demon that takes on the form of Freddy Krueger, and it goes after the people who made the Nightmare on Elm Street films. And in the movie, people like Heather Langenkamp and John Saxon and Robert Englund and Robert Shea and Wes Craven all play themselves in this movie, and the film is this brilliant metafiction piece about how the success of horror films can sometimes negatively impact the people who made them. And I think it's a very smart movie, and truth be told, this is the movie that should have gotten all the praise that Scream got, because this movie does a lot of the same things that Scream would later do, but in my opinion, this movie does it so much better than the Scream movies. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that I'll recognize is not a great movie. This film is a pure guilty pleasure for me. You might be noticing sort of a pattern in this video where I go from talking about guilty pleasures to talking about films that I genuinely think are good movies. But this one, I will say, is a guilty pleasure, and I mainly like this for nostalgic reasons, but that is Pumpkinhead 2, Blood Wings. Once again, it's not a great film. It's a movie I used to love when I was a little kid, and that's why I'm including it in this video, but it really is, objectively speaking, a pretty bad movie. At the same time, though, it does have a cult following, and I know there are people who do genuinely love this movie. I do like the movie, but I like it mostly as a guilty pleasure. That being said, however, the first Pumpkinhead movie, is a genuinely good horror film. This one, though, is much more of a guilty pleasure for me. The next movie I want to talk about is Interview with the Vampire, which was based on the Anne Rice novel of the same name, which was the first book of her series, The Vampire Chronicles. Now, unfortunately, only the first book and then Queen of the Damned, which was the third book in that series, got made into movies, and unfortunately the movie Queen of the Damned sucked pretty badly, and I know Anne Rice completely discredits that movie, but Interview with the Vampire is a really, really good movie. It does change quite a bit from the book, but I do think the movie stays generally pretty faithful to the general themes of the novel. And the acting in this movie is fantastic. Like, Brad Pitt is amazing as Louis, and honestly, Tom Cruise is really good as Lestat, and I'm not a big Tom Cruise fan by any means, but I would actually argue that this is one of his best performances. The next movie I want to talk about is Tales from the Crypt Presents Demon Knight, which I have on the same DVD as Bordello of Blood, which was the other Tales from the Crypt spin-off movie. Now, I do like Bordello of Blood a lot more than I used to, but it's not as good of a film as Demon Knight, though. Demon Knight is a really good movie, and I highly recommend this film, and I think it's a very underrated movie as well. The next movie I want to talk about is Mosquito, which is basically about this alien spaceship that lands in this lake, and the aliens die, and then these mosquitoes start feeding on the aliens' corpses, and the alien blood, like, mutates the mosquitoes into giant mosquitoes. The film is so cheesy, but it's so much damn fun, and the creature effects in the movie are actually really damn good. The next movie I want to talk about is Lord of Illusions, which was written and directed by Clive Barker, and was based on Clive Barker's short story, The Last Illusion. This is a really good movie, and the film features the character of Harry Dumar, who would actually go on to become sort of like a reoccurring character in a lot of Clive Barker's work. Now, I never read the short story that this movie is based on, so I don't know how this movie compares to the original story, but I do really enjoy this film. Now, I'm going to end this video off here and continue with a part 3.